challenge. We're very pleased to see you here. I think we've got quite an exciting couple of hours planned out in terms of getting you thinking, getting some ideas about a very important topic. Okay. When we were coming up for the title for this session, I thought, how on earth can we get across to people the importance of voting, or even just kind of thinking about voting? And all we came up with in the end was, why should anyone bother to vote? And you could say, did we bother about the title? But anyway, that's another thing. I'm very pleased today that we've got a couple of guest speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. I must just go through two very important but boring housekeeping things, okay? You will see I extensively searched Google for these pictures. If you have a mobile telephone, they have caught on, I think, somewhat, since I was a lad. Can you please switch it to silent, or better still, switch it off? Kind of detox. There's a digital detox idea, isn't there? You could do that for a couple of hours. If you can switch them off, just so we don't interrupt our speakers, that'd be great. Don't be alarmed by the picture of a fire. We're not planning or expecting a fire, but you'll be pleased to know that we do have fire alarms and fire exits. Okay. So in the eventuality of a fire alarm, it will either sound intermittent, i.e. it won't be constant, and if you hear that's a test, if it's a continuous sound, unfortunately it's the real thing, and we have to file out of the building in an orderly fashion by the fire exits, which are clearly marked. Okay, it's a bit like being on an airline. Our muster point, I think, is in Guildhall Square, so just outside this building. Okay, hopefully there won't be an inferno out there, so we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Okay. The purpose of today's challenge is to get people thinking about politics at a local level, but also about, I think, the kind of most direct expression of politics, which is voting. I didn't introduce myself, I forgot that bit. I'm James Sandy, I work for Portsmouth City Council, and I manage our communities engagement team, and we do lots of weird and wonderful things, working with local people in terms of consultation and working with community groups, and we work very closely with our elected members, our politicians. And voting is always a challenge. We had, I was saying to James earlier, we had a ward last year in the city where electoral turnout was around 22%. So 22% of people that could vote bothered actually to turn out and vote. For me, there's a question about that. There will be a time where people say, actually, only 10% of people voted. I don't recognise the legitimacy of that. Okay, so then, you know, a bit of fun, but a serious message. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. We have run Local Democracy Week. Certainly, we've run a number of events over the last 4 years. It's been around for a long time. It's something that Congress of Europe coordinate. Congress of Europe is 47 countries, which include, I think, all of the European Union members. We basically try and facilitate some events and activities to get people thinking about and engaged in politics, which is great. All of the things that we're up to this week, you can find out more about on our blog, and I'll give you the address for that later on. Some of you might have had a look at it to register already. Just a quick plug for some of the other stuff we've got coming up. If you want to see democracy in action, how it all works, how councillors in this city make decisions, then tomorrow is your lucky day. Okay, you're very lucky. There's a full council meeting in this very chamber. Okay, so the Lord Mayor of Portsmouth she'll sit here. Okay, and she'll have the chief exec, I think, and the city solicitor either side of her, and they look very worried. Sometimes they sit where Ian is, depending on how they get on, but we won't go into that. So that's a full assembly meeting of the council where they'll consider a number of items on their agenda, and they'll make decisions which will affect council's policy and ultimately will affect how services are delivered or how services are changed, renewed. You might have noticed councils at the moment, the public sector, is having a little bit of a look at itself in terms of how it's funded and what it does. But more on that later on. On Wednesday night, you can relax with a cup of cocoa in the student bar. I'm sure they still sell that down the JCR. Is it still called the JCR? No. I've aged myself already. When I was at university, the JCR was the junior common room. Wasn't that where everyone hung out, really? Yeah, they know. Okay. You can listen to something called Portsea Island Discs, which is a rip-off of Desert Island Discs, and is essentially the Lord Mayor of Portsmouth, talking about her life and her role and choosing some of her choice tunes. There are some very interesting tunes you should have a listen to. You can listen to that on Express FM, which is our local community radio station, which is 93.7 FM, also available on the fabulous internet. Okay? Again, that's increasingly popular. We've got a launch of Health Watch on Wednesday, which is at 1:30 at the Oasis Centre, which is just over the road from the Royal Mail offices, from the Post Office. And we've also got How Parliament Works coming up on Thursday this week, which is scheduled for 3 o'clock in the Civic offices. At the moment, with How Parliament Works, we've got very low sign up for that. And unfortunately, if we don't get higher, we might not run that event on Thursday. So no pressure, but think about that, what you're doing on Thursday. That's my plug and the householding out of the way. I've done all that. I'm going to introduce our speakers very briefly, and then I'm going to ask Rob to kick us off. We've got Dr. Robert Frith from Portsmouth University. Some of you will recognise him. You'll know and love him. He is the Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the Centre for European and International Studies Research, or CESA, I believe it's called. I've got that out of the way, I can breathe now. So it's great to have Rob on board for today. We've also got, from a little bit further afield, Dr. James Sloan, who's the co-director of Centre for European Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the Royal Holloway University of London. I think I got that right as well, which is good. So we're really pleased to see James here today. The idea is that both Rob and James are going to give you some things to think about, some topics, some issues, linked to some of the research and some of the work that they've been doing. And then we're going to open it up very excitingly to an interactive challenge. Okay, we're going to ask you some key questions. You will see somewhere, this piece of paper I'm reading off, there's a guide, an outline to what we're up to, and the questions are written on there. We're not going to be, interrogating you too intently, but I have to say it's very exciting. There is a prize for the winning team. Okay, we're going to break people up into teams. The winning team will get a prize, and that prize is a fantastic prize provided by our colleagues at the Political Studies Association. Jack is here from PSA today, we're really pleased to have him here. You will win a year's subscription to Political Insight magazine. So if you're studying politics, or you're interested in politics, everything you ever need to know is in that magazine. Okay, you don't have to worry if you're in the winning team. Okay, I think I've tantalised them enough with that.
I think so.
So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce very quickly a colleague from the council, which is Ian Fitchett. Ian Fitchett is our electoral services manager. Okay, you might think, well, that sounds a rather exciting title. Ian looks after all the elections that we have in the city. Okay, so he gets very stressed out when we have elections. Any questions you have about voting or about eligibility or about registration, Ian is here on hand today, which is great. It's good to have him here as well. So, we're going to start off now by asking Rob to kick off and just give us a bit of a context in terms of why anyone should bother to vote and where voting is going. And I'll just tinker with the laptop for you. That's a professional term, tinkering. Okay. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, James. As James said, I'm really providing some context, really, and I am very much the prelude to the main act, which is James who's following after me. And James is going to get confusing, isn't it? James said that they hadn't perhaps thought too long about the title for this event, and I think actually it is quite a good title. Why should anyone bother to vote? Because it asks whether we should bother voting, what the value of it is, but also whether, perhaps implicitly in the title, there's other forms of political activity that are perhaps more important and more relevant to the 21st century. And I think James might be picking up on that a little bit after me. And really, I just want to limit myself to three things, really. The first is to consider a little bit the data. I'm always scared of numbers a little bit, to be honest. If it's more than 20, then not only do I have to have my shoes and socks off and my own fingers, and I have to borrow other people's as well. But we do need to look at these things to try and identify what the current trends are a little bit. And then I want to ask the question, well, does this data suggest that there's some sort of crisis of disengagement? And if there is this sense of disengagement, if there is apathy amongst the body politic, amongst the electorate, well, should this be a matter for concern? And I'll outline a couple of different views and ideas on this, but leave it very much up in the air, leave it rather indeterminate for both James to follow up on, and then for yourselves in your conversations. These days, we have opportunities to participate in politics at a variety of different levels, in a variety of different fora. The one which we're perhaps most familiar with is the national context. And what we have here is some voting data in the post-war period up until the most recent elections. And I suppose what we can see, really, if we look at the data here, is that there has been some sort of general decline in voter turnout. In 1950, in the election that was won by Labour, which only secured a small majority, there was a very high turnout. These numbers have been rounded up to the nearest integer, by the way. 84%. Following year, when they called another election, because there were concerns about the small majority it had, again, a very, very similar turnout. And what we seem to have here is these sort of slow decline in numbers. And if we look at these elections here that I've just used for illustrative purposes, they were in some ways really key elections. 1979, when the Conservatives were elected under Thatcher. Highly contested election. 1992, when everyone really expected the Conservatives to lose, and Major actually managed to snatch victory there. 1997, when Labour finally came into office under Blair and New Labour. And then 2010 is highly contested election when everyone kind of expected the Labour Party to lose, as they did in a way, but for the Conservatives to win, where they didn't. So these really were quite crucial elections, but nevertheless, this slow decline. And between 1950 and 2010, we've got a decline here in about 17 percentage points. Yeah? So something that's, in some ways significant, not necessarily statistically significant, but necessarily something that's significant. What if we turn to local government, and it is European Local Democracy Week? Well, there isn't data necessarily available for all the same years, and I've limited myself here. And you'll notice that I haven't bothered with elections perhaps in 1979, or in 1997, or in 2010. And the reason for this is because the elections were held at the same time as they were for the general elections. And the turnout is much higher. It is commensurate with the general election. But if we look at those years when there wasn't the general election, when people are being asked to come out and vote on local issues, then the turnout is far, far lower. Whereas in 1979, we're probably talking of a turnout in excess of 70%, about 76%. 1980, 37%. 92, the year that Major managed to retain power in the Commons for the Conservative Party. The local election held at a different time that year. Much, much lower turnout, just 35%. And again, just the year after the 97 election and all the hullabaloo that surrounded that, less than 30% on average were coming out to vote for these things. And most recently, 2012, just 31%. So we don't see the same kind of gradual decline that we perhaps have done at the national level. Instead, what we have is a very kind of consistently low level of participation, and this kind of almost chronic disengagement. Not only can we vote at the national level and at the local level, but since 1979, we've been able to vote in elections for the European Parliament as well. And in many ways, I think the data here suggests a similar picture to that which we have at the local level. So, 1979, just 32% on average voted for in the European parliamentary elections. 36% in 1994. 24% in 1999. So 24% in 1999, incredibly low turnout there. And just recovering a little for the 2009 elections, a decade later, of 34%. So there's chronic, ongoing, low levels of participation. And if we compare these numbers I've got next to it, these are for the EU average overall, we can see that the turnout in the UK is consistently lower than for the EU average. Now, of course, participation varies considerably amongst other EU member states. But taken on average, the UK well below it. If we look when we had the 9 EU states, the EU 9 in 1979, the turnout average was 60%. And even though it's continued to decline over the years, in 2009 the EU average was still 43%. So 9 percentage points lower in the UK than the EU on average. I suppose one thing to notice there, that more widely there seems to have been a kind of lower levels of participation each time the EU has expanded. In times it's enlarged, levels of participation have reduced somewhat. What explains, perhaps, these differing levels of participation, especially between the local level, the European level, and the national level? Why is there this divergence between the two spheres? And the answer is commonly given in terms of the European elections and the local elections being second-order elections. They're of a second order. And this essentially means that people participate in the local elections and the European elections either to voice their approval or disapproval of the national government, usually at some sort of mid-term point. And quite often, both elections at the local level and the European level are fought by the political parties on national issues. So on issues that really the electorate will have no opportunity to vote on, the terms of the debate are still in these national terms. So, do we have some sort of crisis? Do we have some sort of crisis, a slow-growing crisis in political participation? We'll have some survey data here, and it suggests that 3 in 10 who were surveyed claim to never follow accounts of political and governmental affairs. 3 in 10. So never follow. Not at all. Only 2 in 10 would regard involvement in politics as a preferred non-work activity. So the other 98 have all suggested they prefer to participate in something other than politics as a non-work activity. And finally, 8 in 10 are doubtful of the promises made by candidates in elections. So we have data here that suggests that people are largely disinterested in government and politics, would prefer to be something else, and really don't believe the promises that are made to them by their politicians. And this probably doesn't surprise any of us, really. This is the sorts of stuff we're probably familiar with. What may surprise people is that this was the results of a survey taken in 1959. And not perhaps in 2013 as we may have thought. And the reason I flag this up is because it suggests that actually political disengagement is nothing new. It is nothing new. Rather, it is a long-standing issue. And I suppose if we look at the data for the kind of local elections and the European elections, it bears this out. It's a long-standing issue of non-engagement rather than any sudden rupture in politics we're experiencing in the early 21st century. And the question it raises, I think, is, well, does it actually matter? Does it matter if people are disengaged in politics, if people aren't bothered to going out to vote? And always with these things, there's probably two different arguments we might want to develop. And I do this only initially really. And on the one hand, I think there are good reasons to argue that we probably shouldn't be too concerned about levels of disengagement. First of all, as I said, it's nothing new. It's a long-standing issue. Stubborn alienation rather than any crisis. But does the crisis itself, does the the lack of crisis, the chronic condition, does that raise issues we should be concerned about? Well, first of all, no. No. Our expectations about what democratic involves are simply miscalibrated. We've got the wrong idea about the sorts and kinds and extent of participation that we should be expecting. Early in the post-war period, a political scientist called Joseph Schumpeter wrote a book where he set out the argument that for mass democracies, then when thinking about what democracy actually involves, it must be limited to nothing more than the periodic competitive elections among political elites. That's what it should be limited to. And the implication of this, of course, is that governing really is a matter for the political elites, for those of the political class who actually are interested in politics, which isn't most of us. And that provided there is a reasonable level of trust between ourselves and the politicians, and the nature of the contest and debate between them is reasonable, we shouldn't be too concerned about it. Most of us don't want to participate in politics on a regular basis. A lot of political activity takes up a lot of time. People are busy, and they can think of other things they prefer to do. But even if we just limit it to voting itself, which is, largely speaking, a relatively minimal form of participation, doesn't take up much time, well, non-participation can be deemed to be perfectly rational. The chances of our participation actually making any difference on the margin is negligible. So our participation or non-participation is unlikely to make any difference. So actually, why should we be too bothered about participating? But of course, there may be issues that we are interested in. And of course, we should have that opportunity to participate. And provided that we're actually not disbarred from participating in voting, provided we are enfranchised, then, in a sense, our non-participation perhaps isn't such a great cause for concern as we might think. It's perfectly normal for us to care about some things more than others. So why should we always participate in voting? If we don't really care about it, why should I bother voting? In fact, there are perhaps good reasons I don't bother voting. If I don't really care about it, if it doesn't particularly affect me, but it does concern others, then in a sense, should we be more concerned that those people who it does affect and do have an opinion about it, they get the opportunity to participate? What I'm really talking here is about the happy non-voter. I'm fine, I'm content. I'm not too concerned about these things. Why bother participating? Well, of course, there's the other side of the story here. And perhaps there are reasons for us to be concerned about participation. And the first point really draws upon the point that James pointed out. We're starting to get incredibly low levels of participation. And I suppose the average data that I used here in some way masks these differences. If we start to look at particular constituencies or particular wards, the levels of turnout can be very, very low indeed. And really, this perhaps does in some way start to undermine the legitimacy of our politicians and the collective choices we're asking them to make on our behalf. If we think about the sorts of things that we're probably concerned about as citizens, then it may be issues to do with climate change. It might be to do with issues of nuclear energy. It might be to do with our government's policy with regard to the acquisition or maintenance of nuclear weapons programs. It might be about whether or not our politicians decide to take us into a conflict or go to war. These are difficult, binding decisions. that we're asking them to make on our behalf. And if the levels of turnout are at these very low levels, then really are we giving them the sufficient mandate to make them on our behalf? They may feel constrained and limited in their ability to actually engage in these contentious issues. An alternative, or a supplementary reason we might be concerned about it, is that as ordinary citizens, we might actually want to participate far more than we actually are already, if we believe that our participation counted, if we were properly informed as citizens on matters, and that we had actually the opportunity to participate in a way that we thought was meaningful. What do I mean by participation counting? I'm not simply talking about our vote being counted in that kind of mechanistic sense, but in some way that our participation is meaningful. And there's a sense in which we are perhaps led to believe and think that our participation isn't meaningful, that it won't count. If we think about lots of the things that we are perhaps concerned about, that I just mentioned, things to do with perhaps the environment and so forth, so often we're told that this is something that a government can't engage with simply by themselves, that it requires multilateral collective action, perhaps at what's called global governance level. Well, if these are issues that our governments have little control over, well then there's a sense in which, why should we be too concerned about what their policies on these matters are? We hear similar kinds of arguments about the European level. It's not the government's fault, it's Brussels' fault. It's not our fault, it's Brussels' fault. Well, if this is the case, why should we bother participating in these things? It's going to make no difference. Some things are perhaps considered to be almost too important for politics, issues of human rights. This is beyond politics. This isn't actually a matter of political concern. It's beyond politics. David Chandler, who is an international relations scholar, has written a book recently called Hollow Hegemony, or Hollow Hegemony, depending on how you want to pronounce these things. And I suppose at the root of his argument, at the heart of his thesis, is an accusation he levels against politicians about their unwillingness to engage in the kinds of politics that would generate the necessary widespread coalitions to support these kinds of policies. He says that governments are using these things as an excuse for not engaging in political debate at the national level, or perhaps another level. How often have you been asked to vote on something when you don't really know what it's about? When you don't really know what it's about, where you don't feel that you're properly informed about it? The referendum on changing the voting system we have for general elections, upon the police and crime commissioners, these were things that people felt they weren't sufficiently informed about to actually participate meaningfully. They were concerned about participating. And perhaps people are looking for alternative ways to participate as well. It's not simply about voting. And there's increasing interest in academic fields and policy fields about alternative kinds of involvement that take on a more deliberative kind, an opportunity for people to participate directly in things rather than simply this rather atomistic, individualistic type of political participation. And then finally, I come back to the happy voter. And I say, well, is this voter necessarily so happy? Is this non-participant simply not participating because they are happy and content? And the data suggests that perhaps it isn't this straightforward. And that it's not simply a case that we have people across all different social groups not participating in equal kinds of levels. Instead, what we seem to find is that depending on what your class is, what your gender is, what your ethnicity is, what your age is, will considerably affect whether or not we're going to participate or not. Let me give you just one example. Respondents from the top socioeconomic levels, A, B range, indicated that the likelihood of them participating in voting is going to be about 72%. If you go to the other end of the scale, socioeconomic scale, those of the DE group, well then we're talking 43%. So what we really have here is some suggestion that actually people are being structurally debarred from participating in politics. And of course, this has implications, doesn't it? If people think that there's no point in them participating, why bother participating if you see it as being middle class, middle-aged politics for white men? Why are you going to bother participating? But similarly, if that's the case, then increasingly politicians themselves are going to be putting forward policies that are going to reflect the interests of the people who are engaged, the people who are going to be voting for them. If people aren't participating, people aren't voting, they're not a key group to ensure your electoral success, then increasingly what we might see is the agendas shifting towards the dominant groups, reinforcing this cycle of non-participation. So, what does this all mean? It means that there probably is some sort of ongoing crisis, if you want to call it that, or certainly ongoing issue of relatively low levels of political participation. It does suggest that it's actually declining as well, giving us further cause for concern. It isn't anything new, but if we actually care about politics, then there are some questions raised about what kind of politics we want for the 21st century, what shape it should take, and who should be participating. The final word on my slide there is age as being a relevant social marker. And I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to hand over to James here, who's going to talk far more about the participation of young people in particular.